Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Life is uncertain. It's okay to feel stressed, anxious, worried, or frustrated. It's normal. With CalHope's free and secure mental health resources, it's easy to get the help you and your loved ones need when you need it the most. Call our warm line at 833-317-4673 or live chat at calhope.org today.
Dr. Travis Brown, what is This Medical Life all about?
This is the pursuit of knowledge as we learn about diseases from the ancient times to the present day. These are the stories of medicine.
Hello and welcome to another episode of This Medical Life. And dear GP who's listening into this, of all the episodes we've done, this one is the most ready-made to be shared with patients, I believe, with the guests we've got lined up to cover this detail, as well as doing a deep dive at a medical level. Do you agree with that, Dr. Travis Brown?
I would. Sometimes topics you think, I'll just grab this one and have a bit of a, look, see how we go with, will it be useful for patients and for GPs? And this one turned out to be a lot more involved than what I was expecting. I thought, gout will be useful because it's a common problem. And then you start to dig and you find these amazing stories associated with gout. Now, we've called this, affluent afflictions. It used to be known as the disease of kings. And so, amazingly, the first recorded instance we have of this is 2640 BCE from Egypt.
Oh, we're going back that far. In that case, I'll just top up your port and get our little candied pears.
And they called it podagra, and it was a distinction of two words. One was pos, which is foot, and agara, which was prey. And so this is interpreted as the foot trap. Oh. And so it's mentioned in the Eber and Edwin papyri, which are medical papyri for treatment. Now, amazingly, they actually recommend colchicine. Now, it's from the bulb-like corms of colchicine autumnale plant. And this is actually a treatment we use to this day. And it's amazing that they were using this, thousands of years ago for the treatment of the inflammation and pain that people would get in their foot or in their knee, depending. The problem with it is, and they would have used it, but it wouldn't have been like we use it. So we use it in tablet form. They would have used it as a potion or something to eat. So the problem with that is we know we get gastrointestinal side effects. So you can have nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. But there's no way that they would have had a standard measurement, and so that could have been quite significant.
Some worse than others.
And so that's why we think, they would have used it, and it would have been very effective. But that's why we think it probably didn't catch on, because the side effect profile probably was going to be too much. And so that brings us to Hippocrates in the 5th century BCE. He called it the unwalkable disease. He also called it...
I like that.
Well, he also called it arthritis of the rich. And this was the disease link that he put, that if you had an intemperate lifestyle, if you lacked self-control or had excessive indulgences, you were prone to this arthritis of the rich or the unwalkable disease. And that brings us to the physician Areteus of Cappadocia. And he, in the 2nd century, wrote about this.
Pain seizes the great toe, then the forepart of the heel on which we rest. Next it comes into the arch of the foot. The ankle joint swells last of all. No other pain is more severe than this. Not iron screws, not cords, not the wound of a dagger, nor burning fire.
And so that is the pain that anyone who's had gout would actually experience. I do like how they have the pain, the agony. Not even a dagger was as painful as it. And
I wonder how they described man flu back then.
Well, that takes us to the 13th century, where they actually called it gutta, and this was Latin for drop. Now, the reason is they called it drop is because they saw it as an excess of one of the four humours. And so this excess humour would then drop down to the joint and cause this pain and inflammation. And so this was their understanding of what was going on with the body. It brings us to the English physician in the 17th century, Thomas Sydenham. Now, he suffered from gout and renal disease, and he described it as such.
The patient goes to bed and sleeps quietly until about 2 a.m, when he's awakened by a pain which usually seizes the great toe, but sometimes the heel, the calf of the leg, or the ankle. The pain resembles that of a dislocated bone, and this is immediately succeeded by a chillness, shivering, and a slight fever. The pain, which is mild in the beginning, grows gradually more violent every hour, so exquisitely painful as not to endure the weight of the clothes nor the shaking of the room from a person walking briskly therein.
And so Thomas also noted the linkage. It was rich foods, excess alcohol consumption, and this is why it was known as the disease of the affluent, the disease of kings, because those were the people who would suffer from it. And so around the same time, we start to see, and this is when microscopy started becoming important, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, who was a Dutch scientist, looked at the product that you took from a diseased joint, and he looked at these gouty tophi crystals under the microscope.
I observed the solid matter which to our eyes resembles chalk, and saw to my great astonishment that I was mistaken in my opinion, for it consisted of nothing but long, transparent little particles, many pointed at both ends, and about 4 axes of the globules in length. I cannot better describe that by supposing that we saw with naked eyes pieces from a horsetail cut to a length of 1/6 of an inch, in a quantity of matter of the thousands of these long figures mixed with a small quantity of fluid.
And so what he's describing, and if I can say this, just, when you look down the microscope and you see these crystals, they look like thousands of needles.
That's what I was thinking as I was...
Exactly, and that's what they look like. It looks like. And now I'm trying to work out, is it because they're needles that it hurts so much? Or is it because they're crystals that it hurts so much? Or is it a combination of the two? And again, in a joint, you've got 1,000 little needles. And I'm guessing it's probably both. It will cause inflammation, which will be pain in a joint that really shouldn't have inflammation going on. And you've got these things digging into tissue. And so it's just amazing to see what was going on and their understanding. And now
I don't think I'm going to finish my port.
And then what they started to do was there was a person by the name, scientist Fred Weller, who did a demonstration. Now, I don't know who he got to do this, but he was able to precipitate a gout attack by taking crystals from someone, injecting it into the joint of another person, and they got the same gout, symptoms. And not only that, he injected them into the skin. And so when the skin, you get gouty tophi in the skin, that chalky stuff they talk about is present. And so they were able to reproduce and say they initially thought that, maybe this is a byproduct of the pain. But then they realized, no, this is actually causing the disease.
I could have told them that.
Well, they worked it out a few hundred years ago. And so what they realized, though, was, well, who is this affecting? And so you get this weird distortion of, well, if you have this disease, you are affluent. Therefore, the disease is essentially desirable because it increases your social status in the world. Even in 1900s, the London Times wrote about this.
The common cold is well named, but the gout seems instantly to raise the patient's social status.
And so, a whole bunch of associations started to come with this, some of them completely incorrect. But you get gout, the disease of the rich. If you've got gout, then you are well off. You are, I guess it's the convertible of the 1700s. And so, but then some other associations come. People started to think gout was somehow protective against other diseases. Oh. And even the Archbishop of Canterbury, whose name was Gilbert Sheldon, offered £1,000 to help him get gout so that protect him from other diseases.
Oh, my goodness.
And so it was also believed that it would prolong one's life. And then even there is the sort of a pious point of view from the 16th century Italian physician about gout.
What a man gout makes, devout, morally pure, temperate, circumspect. No one is so mindful of God as the man who is in the clutches of the pain of gout. He who suffers gout cannot forget that he is mortal.
And so we've even got to the point where gout has been indicated in affecting world history. And this is because it is the disease of kings, it would be the disease of the ruling classes. And this is probably no better, demonstrated than the United States. Benjamin Franklin, who's the founding father of the United States, suffered from gout a lot. He suffered significantly. Now, he was a writer, and he wrote about this extensively, and he even wrote and had a conversation with himself and the personification of gout.
Hey, what have I done to merit these cruel sufferings? Many things. You have ate and drank too freely, and too much indulged those legs of yours in their indolence. Who is it that accuses me? It is I, even I, the gout. What? My enemy in person? No, not your enemy. I repeat it, my enemy, for you would not only torment my body to death, but ruin my good name. You reproach me as a glutton and a tippler. Now all the world that knows me would allow that I am neither the one nor the other. The world may think as it pleases. It is always very complacent to itself, and sometimes to its friends. But I very well know that the quantity of meat and drink proper for a man who takes a reasonable degree of exercise would be too much for another who never takes any.
It's even suggested that gout contributed to the American Revolution. There was a person by the name of William Pitt, who was a British statesman in the US. And one time, the Stamp Act of 1765 was being voted upon. Now, William Pitt was opposed to this, had an attack of gout, and when it was being voted on, it passed. The problem with this is it passed a law that was incredibly unpopular because it increased tax payments of the colonists. And they then got a whole bunch of price rises on colonial imports. And this has suggested that it was a factor in leading to the Boston Tea Party of 1773. And then we even have John Hancock, who may have used gout as an excuse because he didn't want to sign the US Constitution at the time, and then was later offered the vice presidency, and then somehow suggested he had a miraculous recovery. And so even in this small instance, you can see the impact that gout has had on world history events.
Well, it seemed to start by tiptoeing through world history, and then it sort of stamped its way through.
And that's why today we're going to have some guests who help us shed some light on gout and our understanding and where we're heading.
Professor Richard Johnson is a professor at the University of Colorado, specialising in internal medicine, nephrology and infectious diseases. Professor Johnson is constantly involved in research, has published 269 articles at the time of recording, and has authored both The Fat Switch in 2012 and Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, released this year, 2022. He has conducted numerous studies into hyperuricemia and gout, and is our guest today on This Medical Life. Welcome to our podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be on your show.
And one last footnote to the GPs listening in particular. This is a book that I think all your patients would enjoy reading. The way you've written it is like a wonderful Sherlock Holmes novel as you dive deeper and deeper into the evidence. So Nature Wants Us to Be Fat is a completely personal recommendation from me as a must-have book. But the one slither that we're tackling today in this podcast is around gout. And I wonder, Professor Richard Johnson, if you could start by defining the disease or even the process of gout.
Yes, so gout is a type of arthritis. It's typically, it's a disease that's more common in men, and it typically presents as an attack of inflammation and redness and pain involving joints, and the classic one is the big toe. But it can get the knee, the wrist, it can hit many different places. And it's due to the crystallization of uric acid that forms these crystals that induce an inflammatory response. And uric acid is a substance that circulates in our blood, and it circulates in the blood of all animals. And it's a breakdown product of basically DNA and RNA and nucleotides and the things that are the ATP. They're really the nuclear nucleotides and kind of the basic products that are used in a cell for energy and replication and DNA. So unlike protein, fat, and carbs, this is really, breakdown products of like nucleic acids. And this is a nitrogen-rich substance, and we normally have to excrete it through our kidneys and our gut. And so it can be, it can also be generated from the foods we eat. And the classic ones are some, things like purine-rich foods, which are foods rich in nitrogen, these nitrogen bases. And basically, it's things like yeast extracts and gravies. Basically, it's from the breakdown products of small cells. So if you have a very cellular food, it'll have a lot of RNA and DNA in it. And so those get broken down to make uric acid. So things like processed red meats and alcohol also can generate it, uric acid. So, classically it was kind of associated with eating rich foods like duck and, caviar and alcohol. But it's also produced from sugar. And so uric acid is produced from sugar. And sugar, or table sugar, is a carbohydrate, of course. It's that consists of a glucose molecule and a fructose molecule bound together. And so they form sucrose, which is table sugar. But when we eat it, the glucose and fructose break up, and then the fructose is, during its metabolism, it actually generates uric acid. And it was known a long time ago that attacks of gout was associated with high uric acid levels in the blood, and with people who are typically dieting on foods that can raise uric acid. And so things like people who are drinking a lot of alcohol or eating a lot of rich foods were particularly at risk for getting gout. Sugar, port wine, that's sweetened wine, it's basically, port is basically alcohol that's got a fair amount of sugar in it.
Yep.
Rum and things like that, they're very, very famous for precipitating gout. And so you get these urate crystals in your joints, and sometimes they can also form in the skin to form what it's called tophi, but they're like nodules. Typically they can be at the side of a joint, like in the fingers, or it can be on the elbow, or it can be on the ear. And so people get these like little nodules, and they get these intermittent, very severe attacks of arthritis, and it's so typically considered so painful that it's very difficult to walk. People can have complained that when the pain hits, that even the bed sheet, when you're lying in bed, that it's painful to have that bed sheet on top of the toe, because it just, even that's too much pressure. So gout, has been a big disease in the past, and it started. It was first really talked about in ancient Egypt. It's in the papyrus writings, and so it was known then. But it was a relatively rare disease, but it became much more common in the last number of centuries as people started drinking more and more alcohol and rich foods. And for a while, it was viewed as a rich man's disease, king of diseases, the disease of kings, because the kings could afford all the sugar that, originally sugar was very expensive, and they could afford the rich foods and the alcohol and the sugar. And so it was, gout was really a rich man's disease for a long time. And then by around 1900, sugar became a lot less expensive, and sugar suddenly became available to the general public, to the common people. Yep. And with that, we started seeing a shift where gout started becoming particularly common in everybody, not just the wealthy, but also even the poor. And so that the old, the gout was a rich man's disease sort of disappeared. And over the last, 50 years, gout has continued to increase. And today, I think it affects like 9 million people in the U.S., and maybe 20 or so million people have high serum uric acids and are at risk for developing gout. And one of the very scary things that's happened just in the last few years has been the discovery that these uric acid crystals are not just going to the joints. And so there was this improvement in a way to look for the uric acid crystals, and there's this special X-ray called the dual energy CT scan. It's sometimes called DEX scan, and that scan can actually look for uric acid crystals, in the joints, and it can identify crystals in the joint just from an X-ray. And when they started finding out that there, maybe 15% of people with high uric acids who don't have gout actually still have crystals in their joints. It's just that they're asymptomatic, or maybe it just causes like a twinge and they can miss it. But the other thing that happened, Steve, was they discovered that these crystals can deposit in the kidneys and the blood vessels and the lung and the eyes and the skin. But the scariest thing is in the blood vessels. And there are now several studies that suggest that these crystals are depositing in the aorta and the coronary arteries, and that maybe in one study, about 80% of patients with gout actually had some crystals in their coronaries or their aorta. And these crystals are pro-inflammatory. They tend to deposit in the plaques. And so it's becoming a very hot area of research and of great clinical importance, because gout is associated with increased cardiovascular mortality and increased cardiovascular disease and increased risk for heart attacks. And now they're finding these crystals in the plaques. And so there's a lot of concern that uric acid crystals may actually have a direct role in heart disease. And I was just at a meeting this last week to talk with national experts on this, and the importance of trying to sort out what exactly is the risk for a person with gout for heart disease, and is it related to these uric acid crystals that are depositing not just in the joints but in the blood vessels and in the plaques.
Oh, that's just amazing, the information there. Look, What other diseases are associated then with elevated hyperuricemic acid? What other disease? You mentioned heart disease. Is there any others?
Yeah, so it turns out that patients with gout often get other diseases, and many of them have obesity, maybe 75%, and it's directly linear. So if you take a serum uric acid and a normal uric acid is probably around 4 milligrams per deciliter, or maybe it's I don't know if you express it that way.
We use millimoles per liter, but we talk with Professor Ken Sikaris about that. So we'll say outside the normal range for yourself. But use your levels.
Outside the normal range, there's like 20 million people in the U.S. where it's outside the normal range, and there's a direct linear relationship of obesity, the prevalence of obesity, with serum uric acid, and the same's true for diabetes, and the same's true for metabolic syndrome. And the same's true for high blood pressure. And the same's true for heart disease. And the same's true for chronic kidney disease. And the same's true for fatty liver, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. It's linear. And as the uric acid gets really high, it starts to become exponential. And so, there is a very strong relationship of gout with obesity, diabetes. And there were these, back in the 1800s, there were these cartoons that were very, very common about the person suffering from gout. And it was typically an overweight person with kind of a red face from drinking alcohol. And, they're surrounded by beautiful foods and port wine and fruit and sugar and all these things that have fructose in it and, rich foods. And they're like sitting there with their painful foot setting on a little bench or something, and they're continuing to gorge on this food. And so it was thought that there was this really strong relationship of gout with these diseases, but it was thought by many that the gout was the consequence of being overweight, the consequence of having diabetes, the consequence of having kidney disease. And so it was thought that when you have kidney disease, you retain uric acid, because I mentioned that uric acid is excreted by the kidney. So if you get kidney disease, you can retain uric acid, get gout, and it's a secondary consequence. And that was the way it was thought. But the problem was that there were all these studies that came out that showed that people who have a high uric acid can get, often the high uric acid precedes the development of hypertension, precedes the development of obesity, precedes the development of diabetes, and then independently predicts that you're going to get it. So like we did this one study in Japan where we took young people with high uric acids and no other risk factors, none. No, they didn't have elevated cholesterol or any kind of lipid problem. They didn't have insulin resistance. Their blood sugars were normal. Their blood pressure was normal. But they were at risk for developing obesity, diabetes, kidney disease, fatty liver, the whole works. So the trouble is that the high uric acid precedes and predicts. So it can't just be a consequence. Now, that doesn't mean that it's also a consequence, because if you get kidney disease, you are going to retain uric acid. And actually, when you look at gout and kidney disease, it becomes kind of exponential. The two are working on each other, right? But anyway, so then that raised the question with the data that it precedes, that it raised that interesting question: could it be causal? And this is where some of my research came in, because I was studying uric acid, but I was also studying sugar. And I knew that sugar raises uric acid. And we had this really interesting data that when we raised uric acid in animals, that they developed high blood pressure. And it was like, what? Can uric acid raise blood pressure? But it was absolutely clear in the rat that was the case. So, then what we said, well, okay, what happens if we give sugar to animals? And it had been reported in people that there's a relationship of sugar intake with the development of high blood pressure and with obesity and with diabetes and with kidney disease and with fatty liver. These associations were already there. And sugar had fructose. Fructose raised uric acid. And so we said, could it be that the uric acid could be playing a role? And so what we did is we gave fructose to animals. And Taka Nakagawa did this when I was at the University of Florida. And what we did was we gave this fructose to these rats, and they developed high blood pressure. They developed obesity. They developed high triglycerides in their blood. They developed fatty liver. The whole bit. They got the metabolic syndrome from fructose, and we could even induce it without giving them extra calories. It was really special to the fructose. And then we lowered the uric acid, and we were thinking that we were only going to see an effect on blood pressure. But my God, when we gave it, we actually could prevent the development of obesity and high triglycerides and all the other features of metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance. And at that point we go, whoa, how can this be? Uric acid must be a waste product. How is it raising blood pressure? How is it doing this? And that took me on a 20-year series of studies. And what we discovered was a pretty interesting story. And so it took us to doing clinical work, trials, and trying to figure it out. But that's sort of the story of my book is, this journey to try to figure out what the uric acid was doing.
Absolutely. And what we just heard there, dear listener, is exactly the nature of this book. It is this peeling back, following the evidence, story by story.
Yeah. Now, can I ask then, that seems like, now you mentioned with the fat switch and the survival switch, this association. So as far as I can say, or what from your answer, it almost sounds like this is a magic trigger. I'm trying to work out how allopurinol doesn't seem to be the most prescribed drug in the world right at the moment if this is an inhibitor. So can you tell us the role?
Yeah, I'd love to go into that. So we're going to take to the next step. Okay, so we had this observation that if you're a laboratory rat and you get sugar, you're going to become fat. And that's not such a surprising finding. But what we found was that if we lowered the uric acid, we could block that. And so what was interesting is that, as a calorie is, when you eat fructose, the fructose gets broken down to generate energy, right? But there's a side reaction that occurs when you eat fructose. There's a reaction that's not involving the caloric pathway. And what happens is, whenever you metabolize food, whenever you convert food into, the calories into energy, there's a little bit of cost to producing energy, right? So you have to spend a little energy to absorb the sugar, and then you have to break it down. So there's a little energy used, and that's true for all nutrients. But there's such a wonderful system in place. So when you eat food, as you burn a little bit of energy to make energy, there's a system to keep the energy from burning too fast. And so what happens is you never lower your energy levels. If the energy levels start to fall from burning it, everything slows down. And so the energy, or ATP, in the cells always stays good when you're eating food. There's one exception. Actually, there's two exceptions. One is fructose, and the other is alcohol. Both of those cause a rapid depletion of energy from the consumption. So when you consume fructose, there's the initial reaction to break fructose down involves an enzyme that uses a little bit of ATP to break down the fructose. And it's pretty unregulated and pretty rapid. And so what happens is when you eat sugar, the fructose will actually drop the ATP levels in the cell. Okay, so the ATP levels fall, and it triggers an alarm signal because the body doesn't want to be in a low energy state.
Mm-hmm.
So it turns out that fructose does this on purpose. Foods don't do things on purpose, but there seems to be a purpose behind this fructose pathway. And what happens is when the fructose level, when fructose is ingested, that acute consumption of ATP actually triggers another series of reactions that keep the ATP levels low. And the way it does that is the ATP gets, when it's used up, it gets converted to AMP, and then the AMP normally gets remetabolized to ATP. There's ADP and AMP, and they get they're used to make more ATP, so it's like a cycle. But what happens here is that AMP gets sucked off, and it gets broken down to uric acid. So the uric acid is removing the ability to replenish the ATP. And then the uric acid does a trick where it goes to the mitochondria and it dampens ATP production by the mitochondria. It reduces the production of ATP. And in turn, the calories get converted to stored energy instead of instant energy. So there's basically, you've got instant energy, which is what we use, ATP. And then if the energy is not used for ATP, a lot of it is converted into stored energy, which is fat. And so normally when we're eating, we're making more ATP. We're not really making a lot of fat. But what fructose does is it blocks, the uric acid blocks that ATP production from the mitochondria. And in turn, the calories get pushed over to make stored energy, which is fat. So it's making fat, keeping the ATP levels low. The low ATP levels make you hungry, so you keep eating more, but you have this shunt going on where instead of making ATP, you're storing fat. And so it takes a while to recover the ATP levels. So it's this really clever system that drops the energy in the cell and makes you hungry, it makes you eat more, and it persists for a while, and then it finally recovers. And so it turns out that there's two main carbohydrates, and one is glucose and one is fructose. And glucose is the main fuel that we use to make ATP, and it's our main fuel for our main carbohydrate fuel that we use. But when we eat fructose, it's there to help make stored energy instead of instant energy. So it's there to prepare you for the future, for a time when there's no food. And what was kind of really interesting was when we realized that fructose was making stored energy as opposed to instant energy. It gave us, the insights into, things like hibernation in animals that suddenly become fat. And then we started studying animals in nature. We actually did studies in bears and hibernating squirrels. And we realized that these animals normally regulate their weight great. And they keep at a very level weight during the summer. And then in the fall, when they know that, when winter is going to come, suddenly they start gaining weight dramatically, and they develop the metabolic syndrome. They get fatty liver, they get fat in their blood, they get adipose fat goes up. They become insulin resistant. Basically, it's the same thing that's happening to humans, but they're doing it purposefully in preparation for winter or for long distance migration or for nesting. And when we started looking at it, we began with the bear, and the bear just eats a ton of fruit that seems to trigger the switch. And not the kind of, a couple of fruit that we eat. They're eating like hundreds of fruits. And thousands of berries and grapes in a 24-hour period. And then they get that large amount of fructose and they activate this biologic switch. And then, they start storing fat, they become insulin resistant. And so we started looking at how this fructose pathway could activate all these things. And we go, oh my God, this is how it works. The fructose is changing the energy of the cell, and it's then driving these biologic processes. And it made us realize that it could actually be a mechanism for driving the whole epidemics we're in, the epidemic of obesity, diabetes, and hypertension, that it could be that big. And so then we wanted to do clinical studies. We wanted to understand the genetics and all that kind of stuff. It keeps going. So
as a layperson, there are two things here for me. If I were going to hibernate for 4 or 5 months, stocking up on a whole lot of fruit, putting on the weight, the body slowing down as a result of that is going to see me nicely through that. But I don't consciously go out and eat a ton of fruit. But I think the rub is there's fructose in just about every aspect of our Western diet. And yet we're not, so we're not aware that we're doing this and flicking this switch. And certainly we're not hibernating as well. And that's the danger combination.
Yeah, so hibernation, what these animals do is they start getting really fat. And then it's been shown that kind of what triggers the hibernation is when the food becomes less available to find. And then they actually drop, go into torpor and hibernate. But they're actually, while they're gaining weight, they've dropped their energy metabolism. So they're dropped their resting energy metabolism, and they're eating more. So they're really kind of decreasing their metabolism, kind of like what we tend to do when we get overweight. And so for us, you've got it right. The biggest thing, the most obvious one, is that sugar intake started to skyrocket. In 1700, we were eating like 4 pounds of sugar per capita per year. I mean, that's not very much. In 1800, it was like 18 pounds. And in 1900, it was like 90 pounds. And what happened was there were two major things that happened. There was the introduction, first off, there was the plantations that really dramatically increased sugar production. And that was mainly from the Americas and from these islands off the coast of Portugal and Africa, where they were able to really increase sugar production from sugarcane. And then when Napoleon, was at war, it turned out that Europe was not getting as much sugar. So they actually there was a contest to try to figure out how to get sugar from sugar beets. And they were able to do it. And then Napoleon started building all these started making sugar from sugar beets. And that was, really increased sugar production. And then originally there were all these taxes on sugar, but then they were reduced. And then the sugar tax was completely removed, like in the mid 1800s. And so by 1900, sugar was finally beginning to be less expensive and affordable. Soft drinks got introduced, and pretty soon sugar intake starts going way up, and you can map it as the sugar intake goes up. So did obesity, so did diabetes, everything. They go in parallel. It's like beautiful. And then in the 1970s in the US, they learned how to make high fructose corn syrup, which was basically to take corn syrup, and you can use the enzymes to convert the glucose to fructose. And when they did this, they were able to make a sweeter corn syrup that had fructose and glucose in it. And then they found that the perfect ratio that people love is to have the fructose a little bit higher than the glucose. So it's like 55, 45, 60, 40, and even 65, 35. So then the high fructose corn syrup basically had more fructose, and it was liquid, and it could be mixed into food, and so it could really be made. You could really like hide it in the food, and so it started being added to all these processed foods, and before you know it, 75% of processed foods have sugar in it. 75% of drinks have sugar in it. I mean, it started or high fructose corn syrup. And so it really just took over. And so that by far is the main driver of this obesity epidemic, it looks like. But, it turned out that there were a couple really big surprises along the way. And one of them was the discovery that the body can make fructose. And I don't know if you want to go into that, but that turned out to be a pretty horrible discovery.
I think we're going to see that there's a reason to get you back on a future podcast that can focus on that particular bit, and our listeners would have read your book by then too, about our recommendation.
So almost just a second final question. So with allopurinol then, and with all the linkages that we have, when would it be appropriate that allopurinol is prescribed for patients? Do you do it almost as a preventative type?
Okay, now we're going to get into the great controversy. So what happened was, in the animal, you can show that fructose can drive the development of kidney disease, fructose can drive the development of fatty liver, fructose can drive hypertension, and even in humans, if you give fructose to humans, blood pressure goes up. You give allopurinol, you can block the rise in blood pressure from fructose in people. And likewise, so there's a lot of data supporting it. But there is this sort of interesting finding that the effects of allopurinol, so allopurinol is a drug that lowers uric acid. There are lots of studies that show that it can improve insulin resistance, a couple studies showing that it can reduce weight gain, but it isn't like the black and white findings we find, like if you're a laboratory rat and we give you fructose and we really block obesity. So it seems like it's only like a partial benefit in people. And some studies have been negative, some are very positive, but it isn't 100%. And so here's what we believe is going on, and it looks like there's two. Like we originally did this with studying high blood pressure, and what we found, I'm going to tell you the high blood pressure story, and I'll sort of give you an insight into the others. So what we found is that when we raise uric acid in a laboratory rat, they develop hypertension. Okay, and we've done it multiple ways, right? And they develop high blood pressure, and we actually identified how it works, and it's causing endothelial dysfunction and activation of the renin-angiotensin system. And if you lower the uric acid, you lower blood pressure. But then what we found was that if you just keep the uric acid level high for several months, okay, and their blood pressure is high, then if you lower the uric acid, the blood pressure stays high. It doesn't come down. And then when we looked, we said, well, why is that? And we found that in the kidneys, there was inflammation that had developed from the high uric acid. And the inflammation was actually keeping the blood vessels vasoconstricted or constricted in the kidney and preventing the kidney from getting rid of the salt very easily. And so there was the hypertension was now being driven by the kidney. And I was also a high blood pressure person, and I knew that people with chronic hypertension have this inflammation in their kidneys, and we actually discovered that there was an autoimmune component to it. It's a whole story in itself. But basically, the kidneys become the cause of hypertension after a long time. So what we did is, that made me think that maybe uric acid is the initiator, and then it causes low-grade kidney injury that drives the hypertension. So it was right around that time, we just did that experiment in the animal, when a young man named Dan Feig came into my office, and he was a young physician, academician, young professor. He wanted to do research. And he was running a pediatric hypertension clinic. And he had all these adolescents, and originally, 30 years ago, if you had high blood pressure as a kid, it was almost some hereditary or congenital problem. But nowadays, obesity and diabetes and hypertension are occurring in adolescence, and you have a lot of overweight children. And Houston, which is where I was at the time, had some of the greatest obesity rates in the U.S. And we had these very overweight children, many of them drinking lots of soft drinks and sugar, and they were developing plain old hypertension. So I asked Dan to measure their uric acids. And we had a nice relationship of serum uric acid with blood pressure in the rat. But, human studies are usually not so as good as the laboratory animal. But about 3 months later, he came back and he says, "You won't believe it. The R value is like 0.9. And he showed me this curve, and it was better than for my animals. I mean, the higher your uric acid, the higher the blood pressure. And he eliminated the hereditary ones. I have to say, this was the true primary hypertension associated with obesity. So I got him to write a grant, and he wanted to write the grant. I didn't get him to write the grant. He wrote this beautiful grant to treat the children with allopurinol, and it was a double-blind crossover trial. It was going to test whether our laboratory rats were telling us the truth or not. And we did the study, 30-some children in this crossover trial. And when they were getting placebo, only 1 out of 30 had their blood pressure correct. But when they got the allopurinol, 90% of them normalized their blood pressure. Completely normal, no blood pressure medicine. Actually, these kids had never received any medicine. And the allopurinol corrected it. We published it in the JAMA because it was such a big discovery. And then later we started doing some studies in older people, and we did find that the effects were much less. We did see an effect, but it wasn't as dramatic. I mean, these kids normalized their blood pressure. So I do believe that that allopurinol works, but you have to catch it early.
We are definitely going to have to book a return ticket. I suppose now, just with time against us for this one, GPs who are listening to this, when it comes to gout in patients, what would be your pithy little bit of wisdom? What would you make them aware of as they're facing a patient who is presenting with gout or the symptoms of gout?
So absolutely. So the number one thing is you first begin by talking to them about diet. And you point out that it isn't just purine-rich foods. And of the purine-rich foods, it's mainly the meats. It's not the vegetables. Purine-rich vegetables do not have the specific type of purine that raises uric acid very well. So it's really processed red meats, beer, and it's because of the yeast extract in beer. Really rich foods like caviar, lobster, shrimp. You have to cut it back. No one wants you to stop it, but you want to be aware that these are the foods that can precipitate it. And sugar. And then you talk about cutting out soft drinks, and it's liquid sugar that's by far the worst. Fruit juice is not good. An occasional fruit, okay, but if you really have terrible gout, even some fruit may trigger it. And so you talk about the triggers. So the foods are these triggers: alcohol, sugar, processed red meats. Okay. Then the next thing you do is obviously you measure the uric acid. If the uric acid is over 6, and they have gout, you put them on allopurinol, or you put them on another drug like febuxostat. If there's certain people who can get a reaction, allergic reaction to allopurinol. It can be like a Stevens-Johnson syndrome. Actually, it can be pretty bad. So, but it's seen primarily in the Han Chinese and in African American or Black that have the highest risk for it. In the Han Chinese, it's like 6%, so it's really quite significant in that group. So if they're Han Chinese, don't give them allopurinol, give them febuxostat or some other drug like that. And maybe also if they're African American, you may want to go to febuxostat. But basically, you want to get that uric acid under 6. And then you've got to realize that it isn't, gout is not just a nuisance. A lot of people say, oh, I got a bout of gout. It's terrible, but I took some indomethacin or I took some ibuprofen and the pain went away and I'm fine. No, you're not fine, because we know those crystals are causing systemic inflammation. We know those crystals are not just in your joints, that you may have scattered crystals in your blood vessels. So you got to get the uric acid. If they have gout, you got to get the uric acid down under 6. And that is really important. So I would, and drink lots of water. Water turns out to be this wonderful, it actually is a benefit beyond just what you think. We can talk about it next time I come.
Yes.
But we've done some pretty good studies on the benefits of water.
Who would have thought water at the end of the day is such a valuable part of life?
It's so amazing.
Professor Richard Johnson, thank you so much. If you would indulge us, it would be wonderful to have a return visit where we can go deeper into some of that. In the meantime, we'll put links to your book, Nature Wants Us to Be Fat. And also, little birdie's told me there are some good YouTube videos of you that are doing the round, so we'll embed a couple of those into the show notes as well. So thanks for joining us on This Medical Life.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Really, it's great being on your show, and I appreciate it.
Professor Ken Sikaris is a chemical pathologist and Director of Chemical Pathology at Melbourne Pathology. Professor Sikaris is a NATA accredited laboratory assessor, founding fellow of the RCPA Faculty of Science, and a principal examiner in Pathology Informatics. He's a fellow of the Department of Pathology at the University of Melbourne. During his day job, he supervises thousands of patient tests each day and is well known for quality assurance and defining decision limits for blood tests. But he's also an advocate of the low-carb diet on YouTube, where he's attracted more than 500,000 views and was Professor Blood in the Australian documentary That Sugar Film. Professor Ken Sikaris is a returning guest here on This Medical Life. Welcome back, Ken.
Thanks, Steve. Great to be back.
Thanks very much for being here, Ken. Look, we're looking at gout, we're looking at hyperuricemic patients, and we're looking at, every time a doctor requests chemistry, they get a uric acid result. And in males, it's, 0.2 to 0.5 millimole per litre, and for females, it's 0.15 to 4 millimoles per litre. Now, they'll often get it just routinely, but how significant is an incidental elevated uric acid?
Thanks, Travis. A couple of things. First of all, you say that they routinely get uric acid. It's been a habit over the last 30 years, whenever you get routine biochemistry, to throw in a uric acid, but that's not the general pattern because it's a separate request and can be charged for. So it should be requested on demand. But I take your point, particularly in insurance screens and so on, the uric acid is sort of thrown in as part of the general chemistry. I would always take notice of a uric acid outside of those ranges, because those ranges are very generous. They're based on the reference interval for uric acid, which describes uric acid in let's say, the general Australian population. And because the general Australian population has such a high risk of pre-diabetes and diabetes, we actually try to mask a lot of that by saying, well, you're just a normal Australian, a normal fat Australian. so really, the risks of everything to do with uric acid rise at about 0.43 for men and probably around 0.4 for women. And so that by the time you get to 0.5 for a man, you're really an outlier, and you should always take notice of that. So, I mean, this is the challenge of, this area that I'm interested in, the reference interval, what's typical in a population, and a clinical decision limit, which is when are you at risk.
So then with the uric acid above, you would put 0.5 for men as almost a red flag that this something should be done at this point in time?
Yes, I think that you can't ignore it. The urgency is a separate issue. So we have critical limits in the laboratory where, we wake up doctors in the middle of the night because the level's so high. Now, that's what we call a true red flag, a critical limit. Mm-hmm. The critical limits for uric acid are like 0.6 or 0.7, way above 0.5. Mm-hmm. So at that stage, there's a real risk that the patient's damaging their kidney and can develop urate stones and so on. So, around 0.7, it's a critical limit. And there's a lot of cancer patients can have very high uric acid levels as well that we need to let them know quickly about. 0.5 is not something you need to do something overnight for, but it's certainly something you need to address in the next few weeks.
So is it lower for women? Would you say a 0.45 for women, or what's that?
Probably around 0.43 for women. So, we flag everything above 0.4, but we know that the risk of gout sort of starts, in a physicochemical, explanation is at about 0.43. That's the value that's taken. So for a woman, it's unusual to be above 0.4, and it's dangerous to be above 0.43. So I think that you should address that.
Then looking at hyperuricemia, is there any patients who are more at risk of having this?
Yes, well, I'm very much aware that you're going to be speaking to Richard Johnson, who's sort of looked into this. But the classical risk factors for high uric acid include alcohol, diabetes, being overweight. There are some iatrogenic risk factors like thiazide diuretics and so on, loop diuretics. But the most common risk factor is that pre-diabetic risk of being overweight and obese. It doubles, more than doubles your risk of having gout, and it's a flag that there's you may have pre-diabetes.
Okay, so then let's say we've got two patients. One's otherwise seemingly healthy person about the age of 50, and then we have the same sort of demographics of the patient, but they have comorbidities. Such as type 2 diabetes, hypertension. Let's say they have the same uric acid result of 0.5. Is one more or less critical than the other? Is that significant in the difference between the two patients?
Overall, probably not. It's a debatable area at the moment. People have been looking at uric acid as an independent risk factor for gout or cardiovascular disease. And the results have been conflicting. In my mind, there's no difference because uric acid is a risk factor which correlates with all of those other risk factors. And so usually you find those studies that do find it to be an independent risk factor, they haven't totally accounted for the other factors. There's another issue there that, if you do it in young people and older people, women don't really have all of those risks until post-menopause. And so, if you look at women post-menopause, then uric acid is a strong predictor, but before menopause, it sort of dilutes the importance of uric acid in men. So overall, I would say there's no reason to ignore a uric acid in somebody that doesn't have comorbidity. And similarly, in somebody who does have comorbidity, you're already aware that they're at risk, and the uric acid just helps to confirm that risk. So I wouldn't distinguish those two people.
Now, we're talking pretty much about serum, so blood tests that we're talking the uric acid blood. When is urinary uric acid an appropriate test, and what are we looking for?
Yeah, it's quite a common test we do. So the idea, if you've got a high uric acid level, it's either because you're overproducing uric acid or you're under excreting uric acid. Now, the urine uric acid obviously tells us the difference, because if you've got a high blood level and there's a high excretion, you must be producing lots. Whereas if you've got a high blood level and a low uric acid, then you're unable to excrete it. So it helps you decide what the etiology is. Not that you can do much about it, because it's probably, well, other than treating the pre-diabetes. But, it used to be said that, if the problem is you're not excreting, then you should give something that helps with excretion, like probenecid. But the problem is that, if you increase the amount of uric acid in the urine, you risk of causing stones. And so it's, really it's sort of interest to understand what the cause is, and maybe for dietary management and all of that. But it doesn't really change the fact that the treatment is to reduce production with allopurinol.
Is there a difference between taking a spot sample for urinary uric acid and 24 hours sample?
Yes, there is. Now, uric acid, as we know, precipitates and forms crystals, and it does that in an acid environment. Now, so for both a spot sample and for a 24-hour sample, ideally they should be alkalinized to prevent the uric acid precipitating. Now, often spot samples aren't alkalinized. You sort of imagine that they're fresh and they don't need to be alkalinized because it gets to the lab and run very quickly. But that's not true. We don't know how long that sample is sat in the fridge of the patient and all of that, so the uric acid may have fallen out. So, we generally prefer a 24-hour alkalinized sample, because the other thing is, when we put in that alkalinizing agent, some sodium bicarb or something, patients often see this stuff in the container and say, we better get rid of that. It might affect my results. And so we always test the urine on arrival to make sure it's been alkalinized. But the other part to that, Travis, is that in a spot sample, if you really want to, because the spot sample will vary depending on how much water a patient's drunk.
Yeah.
So we could use the creatinine level of the urine to correct, as we do for albumin-creatinine ratios. You could do a uric acid creatinine ratio. And you might think, well, that's much more convenient for the patient. But the problem is, it might have fixed up a little bit of the error in correcting for the dilution, but creatinine comes from muscle. And so the amount of creatinine in a spot sample varies according to the muscle mass of the patient, not just how much water they've drunk. And so the uric acid creatinine ratios really should be adjusted according to gender and age for the amount of muscle. So overall, there's all the gains of a spot sample are not significant compared to the downside of a spot sample. So the preferred sample is still 24-hour urine.
And just to throw a spanner in the works, someone like me who does do his best to do intermittent fasting, should I also be alerting my GP to that if I was doing one of these tests? Would that, at what point I'm in that fast, affect this test?
I don't think so. Most of the uric acid, 2/3 of the uric acid in your urine, let's say, is uric acid that you've made. It's not from a dietary source. So it will make a little bit of a difference how much protein you've had, or really hot seafood has got even more uric acid in it. Yeah. Well, purines in it. I would say that ideally you should be, well, with any sample, a 24-hour urine sample, it should be representing your typical way of life. So if you are, predominantly fasted, well, then take that sample. But if that's an unusual situation for you, then it's slightly misleading, but not totally misleading. Okay.
Now, sometimes when people are suspected of having an episode of acute gout, the siric acid is used as a test. Is it any use in testing siric acid in a patient who you suspect has gout?
We generally say no. It's very can be very misleading, particularly, let's say we're using a uric acid level of 0.5, which I've already said is an overestimate of the risk. if you're expecting a patient with with gout to have a uric acid level of 0.5, you're going to miss most of them. Whereas if you had a cutoff of 0.3, you'll get some of them. But the general, the average level for a man is around 0.35, the average level for a man. So in a way, if somebody's got something that looks clinically like gout and your uric acid is above average, about 0.35, well, it's probably gout. So really, and there are some sort of chemical explanations of that, because in a way the gouty tophi is very inflamed and acidic. And the idea is that acts as a sink. Any uric acid that comes past that acidic area just precipitates out there and then, and it sort of lowers your blood level. That's the theory, at least. So yeah, that's the biggest risk with gout, is that people rely on a apparently normal uric acid as being excluding gout, and that's just not true.
Yeah, I do remember that sort of a diagnostic test is to actually stick a needle in it and pull out some of the crystals, but most patients aren't really don't like that idea, which I can imagine if I've got a really sore joint, someone comes at me with a needle. So
yeah, we do. I mean, rheumatologists like to do that. Maybe they've got more permission than the average doctor, but we do get them, and you can look at them under polarizing light and identify them. But you generally don't need.
Well, the important point to note there is that formalin does dissolve them. So if you send it to us with tissue in formalin, sometimes it can be indicative of gout, but we often get the crystals dissolved, so you can't sometimes see it. You need fresh tissue.
You are smiling with too much glee. As you pointed out.
That's okay.
Well, Professor Blood, I feel like I'm sitting next to Dr. Needle here. Just to close off, is there any advice you have for GPs about gout? Just general off the cuff. You bump into a GP, they ask you this question, what should they be aware of? What things should be routine? What would you say?
Well, certainly do the test. It's a very cheap test. So if in doubt, do the test, and don't be misled by that result. As we said before, we did have a debate in the pathology community about whether we should be reporting 0.43, which is the risk point for gout for all men, to help to lessen this problem of missing gout. But the problem is at 0.43, something like 40% of Australian men would flag. So we're sort of caught between a rock and a hard place, that we don't want to flag such a large proportion of men, but we also don't want to miss acute gout. So so just have those two, have the 0.43 figure in your mind, even though the 0.5 figure is on the paper, until we sort out commenting and some electronic smarts to help you interpret that result.
So, if in doubt, test for gout.
Very good, Steve.
Thank you. On that note, Professor Ken Sikaris, thanks for once again joining This Medical Life. This Medical Life is recorded in the Talked About Marketing Studios in Adelaide. For show notes and more information about the podcast, visit thismedicallife.com.au. You can contact the hosts via Twitter. Dr. Travis Brown is at Dr. Travis Brown. That's DR for doctor. And Steve Davis is at Steve Davis. Editing and production is by Tim Whiffen. Design is by Tom Buzenjut. This has been a PathNotes Proprietary Limited production.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.